I'm thankful that you've decided to join me for another week of our 4.5 year verse by verse journey through all of God's inspired word. We are going to resume our study in Matthew chapter 27 in just a moment. First, I want to remind you we're looking at the events of Good Friday. Now, the reason we refer to it as Good Friday now is because it was the Day of the Atonement, and that was really good for us. Plus, we know that the rest of the story results in Jesus being resurrected from the dead on the first day of the week, 3 days later, and that's really good news. But so far, we have looked at how the Jewish Sanhedrin, having had their preliminary hearing at the residence of Caiaphas the high priest in the wee hours of the morning on Friday, then met in the council chamber so that when the sun came up, they could very quickly put on an official trial, demanding of Jesus to answer the same question that he'd answered in the preliminary hearing: "Are you the Son of the Most High?" And he would answer, "I am," and would also even repeat the idea that he would be a fulfillment of Daniel chapter number 7, that they would see him coming with the clouds of glory. And that allowed them to then make the claim and condemnation for blasphemy. Now, it's not blasphemous, it's true, but they don't believe it's true. So by the time that the sun had only been up for a matter of minutes, probably somewhere just after 6:30 in the morning by our clock standard, Jesus had been condemned to death by the Sanhedrin. And the whole council then got up to take him from the council chamber, which is in, I think, the northern section of the shrine area of the Temple Mount, over to the fortress of Antonia, which is the Praetorium. It's the headquarter palace for the Roman contingent at Jerusalem, and therefore the place where Pilate spent his time when he was in town. And that's only a matter of a few hundred feet to walk from one place to the other. And we talked a little bit about when they first arrived at the Praetorium. We'll get back to that again as a review in a moment, because we kind of skipped over something that I was not exactly sure when we wanted to talk about it. But since we're starting fresh today, let's talk about it now. Matthew chapter 27, verse number 2 says, "They bound him," meaning Jesus, meaning the Sanhedrin, after his official trial and condemnation, "and they led him away and delivered him over to Pilate the governor." We'll resume with John's take on all of that in a moment. But Matthew is the one that throws in this information at this particular juncture. Verse 3. "Then when Judas his betrayer saw that Jesus was condemned, he changed his mind." This is where we understand Judas was not on board with the idea of Jesus being killed. I'm not sure what he thought was going to happen when he offered to betray him. He seems to have lost his faith in Jesus as Messiah, but I'm not altogether convinced that he believed his actions would result in his death. Perhaps he thought Jesus would be beaten. Perhaps he thought Jesus would be shamed, excommunicated from Jewish society, whatever. But the moment he realizes that Jesus is being handed over by the Sanhedrin to the Romans for crucifixion, it breaks him. Now, the other apostles have been broken too on this night. But there is a huge difference between what Peter did, for example, when he denied Jesus 3 times and ends up bitterly weeping, because he will repent. He will change the way he thinks. He'll change his heart, and he will come back into right relationship with Jesus. And Jesus already knew about this and predicted it. Peter, when you have turned, which is a Jewish way of saying repent, when you've turned, then strengthen your brothers. Get them back on track. But when it says here that Judas changed his mind, it doesn't mean repent. It just means that he regretted that his actions were going to result in Jesus' death. And he does not genuinely repent from his heart. He instead sets himself on self-destruction, that is, suicide, which makes his story one of the most sad stories in all of human history. So he brought back the 30 pieces of silver. That's 30 shekels of the temple. So it's equivalent to about 60 days' wages for a little over 2 months' worth of wages, since the Jewish people would have worked 6 days a week. So he brings that back to the chief priests and the elders, and he was saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. And their response to him, what is that to us? See to it yourself. They don't care. They got out of him what they wanted, which was Jesus was betrayed in a private sort of setting so that they didn't have to worry about the mob. They believe that they are on schedule to get him condemned by the Romans in a rubber stamp ceremony and then crucified before anybody's really up and around today. Now, they're going to find that that schedule gets changed by Pilate, but nevertheless, at this point, they figure they've gotten what they wanted, and they don't care. You need to go take care of your own guilt. Verse number 5, throwing down the pieces of silver into the temple. And the word for temple in this passage is the word for the inner sacred area. So he's not throwing it into the temple complex generically. He's throwing it into the area where the priests do their work. Now, I don't think he actually threw it into the shrine building, because that would have been very difficult for him to get past security to do that, I think. But he does throw it into the worship area of the complex to show that he doesn't want this money anymore. And then he departed, and he went and he hanged himself. We get ahead of the story at this point, and we will come back to it again later when we get into the book of Acts, Lord willing, that he apparently went and hanged himself outside the city of Jerusalem at a clay quarry that was part of a complex for pottery making. Why did he go there? He seems to have chosen there because it would have been deserted at this time. It's the holiday. This is the day on which all the sacrificial lambs are going to be slain. People are not at work. They're participating in that. And then the next day is going to be the Sabbath day, and then the Feast of Tabernacles, Feast of Unleavened Bread will continue for about the next week. So he picks a place where he knows no one is going to find his body, at least for a few days. So he goes there and hangs himself. Luke will later tell us in the book of Acts that his body falls from this hanging place. Either the rope or the belt or the cloth or whatever he used to hang himself failed or came unloose, or possibly the branch broke on the tree or whatever it was he'd secured it on, or whatever. For whatever reason, his body that had been hanging there for a couple of days fell and burst open. Sorry for those of you with sensitivities along those things. And when this happened, the whole property where he did this became contaminated by his suicide blood. And that is why this property then comes on the market, because it can no longer be used by the pottery makers to make pots for human consumption use. So, once it's on the market, Matthew tells us more of the story. Verse number 9. The chief priest, taking the pieces of silver, said, "It's not lawful to put them into the treasury, since it is blood money." Now, that's that weird scruples thing that we were talking about during the trial. These Pharisees are insane about keeping their own rules. This is why they had to have the preliminary hearing, which would then lead to the official trial after the sun came up in the council chamber. This is why they couldn't rely on the witnesses, because they couldn't get two witnesses to provide the exact same, quote, testimony that would condemn Jesus. They're picky like that. And so here they are saying, we can't put this blood money, where we paid him to betray his friend, his master, we can't put that into the general funds. So, verse 7, they took counsel. They started talking about it, and eventually they found out that this piece of property was on the market. So they bought with them the potter's field as a burial place for strangers. That is, people without family members that can perform the rituals of internment. And so this is why in the book of Acts, Luke says that Judas purchased this field. Well, he did in an ironic way, because he provided the funds to the Sanhedrin, which bought the field where he committed suicide. And it is even possible that he ended up being one of the first ones buried there. Verse 8, therefore, that field has been called the field of blood to this day. Hakeldama means the field of blood. And in this case, it's the blood that contaminated it from Judas's suicide. And it's also the blood that he had betrayed. So it's a double entendre. It's a double meaning sort of usage here. Matthew, who is always focused on trying to tie in events to the prophecies of old, says this, then was fulfilled what had been spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. And it's not just the story of the potter's house in Jeremiah. There's also a tie-in to the book of Zechariah. And Zechariah ends up coming into the context here. They took 30 pieces of silver, the price of him on whom a price had been set by some of the sons of Israel, and they gave them for the potter's field as the Lord directed me. So you can look in the book of Jeremiah, and there's stories about the potter and the potter's house, but in Zechariah is the specific wording about the 30 pieces of silver. So all of that, Matthew says, comes together and shows how God knew ahead of time how all this would play out. All right, now let's get back on track with the Roman trial. John chapter 18, where we read last time, let's read it again. John chapter 18 says this is verse 28, they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. Now, that was also past the chamber of the Sanhedrin, because they had a little brief trial there, not very long. A few minutes was all they needed. And then they condemned him, and then it was off to the Praetorium immediately north of the temple complex. It was early morning. We already know it must have been somewhere just after sunrise that the trial took place. So they're arriving at the Praetorium maybe 6:45 by our time. Now keep in mind, they had a different time schedule that they used. Sunrise for the Jewish people was the beginning of timekeeping. So it was the beginning of like 1, 2, 3 to 9 o'clock in the morning. That'd be the third hour. And then another 3 to noon, because that's the 6th hour. Now, the Romans kept a different time schedule. They did from midnight to 12 noon, 12 hours. So right around sunrise would be about the 6th hour. And so that's the time that we're looking at here. Roman officials were in the habit of making themselves available for visitors, for clients to start calling on them shortly after sunrise. So Pilate is already on the clock when the Sanhedrin shows up here shortly after sunrise. Back to the text, middle of verse 28. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. This is the 14th day. They need to butcher their Passover lambs tonight, this afternoon late, and then they will eat the meal right after sunset. So they want to keep themselves ceremonially pure, which means they cannot enter a Gentile household or a Gentile establishment. The Tower of Antonia is the praetorium of the Roman government in Judea, in Jerusalem. So it is counted as Gentile. So Pilate, out of accommodation to them, which I told you he begrudgingly became accommodating to Jewish scruples ever since he first arrived and he ran into a problem with them. So he went outside to them and he said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" So otherwise, okay, you're bringing me somebody very specific. What are you accusing him of? Now they answered him, "If this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you." Now that wording tells me that they'd already communicated to him that they believe this should be a rubber stamp situation. We have condemned him, and you need to carry out a sentence. Pilate says back to them, "Take him yourself, judge him by your own law." And the Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." So they are trying to explain to him, we have condemned him to death, but you have to carry out the charge, or you have to carry out the execution. John tells us that, verse 32. This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to show, but by what kind of death he was going to die. He kept talking about being crucified and then being resurrected on the 3rd day. Stoning was the official Jewish way of executing people. Crucifixion was the way that the Romans crucified non-citizens, which Jesus is a non-citizen of the Roman Empire. So, what are they accusing him of? Let's read from Luke 22 at this point. Luke 23. Got to get the right chapter here. Luke 23, verse 1. Then the whole company of them arose and brought him before Pilate. We've talked about that. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation." Now that's exclusively Jewish. Does not carry a death penalty as far as the Romans are concerned. And forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar. Now that's a flat out lie. But it could be they thought they could manipulate him with that line, because that would definitely be something the Romans would react negatively to. But then comes the big one. This is the one they're going to focus on a lot. And saying that he himself is Christos, a king. He's claiming to be the king of the Jews. Now, king of the Jews is a title that was first given by the Roman Senate to Herod the Great. And then Augustus Caesar was in control of it as to whether or not he would give it to the heir of Herod the Great, Archelaus, which he chose not to, although he said, if you do well, I will designate you as king of the Jews. When Archelaus was removed in AD 6 from his tetrarchy, or excuse me, his ethnarchy, that is the ruler of a people, an ethnic group, he was not replaced with another Jewish king. Instead, he was replaced in Judea by a Roman prefect. So this is a title that only Rome is permitted to designate any Jewish person with. And so this would be a charge worthy of execution from a Roman standard. It would be claiming to be a king when you are not. And so Pilate decides to focus on that charge. That's where John 18 picks up the story. Now, Matthew, Mark, Luke, all three of them have him asking the question to Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? Is that what you think you are? So now let's look at the focus of John 18:33. So Pilate entered his headquarters again, leaving the Jewish people out front, and he called Jesus and said to him, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus answered, do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me? So Jesus says, have you come up with that idea, or did you get it from somebody else? Pilate answered, am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. So Pilate is like, why don't you just tell me what's going on here? Because apparently your own high council says that you've done something wrong. So what have you done? Verse 36, Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. Now that's very plain, but it needs to be put in its proper context here. When it says this world, it's talking about the here and now of Jesus' context. Jesus will be King of kings and Lord of lords in the new heaven and the new earth. But at this time, he is providing the atoning sacrifice for sin. So he has not arrived to be king just yet. So he says, if my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, and I might not be delivered over to the Jews. Now, Peter obviously tried to do that, and Jesus shut it down. Then Jesus finishes, but my kingdom is not from the world. So Pilate said back to him, so you are a king. So everything that Jesus just said is only focused on the idea, I'm not a king of this specific world right now. But Pilate says, okay, so you are some sort of king. And Jesus answered, you say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. So Jesus acknowledges, yes, I am a king. That's why I came here. Remember all the birth stories, Jesus was hailed as the king. So he says, that's why I came here, but more specifically, I'm here to bear witness to truth. And everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. Now remember, he said on one occasion, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except by me. So Jesus is presenting himself as truth, as access to the ultimate truth. And Pilate's response to him, having heard those words, sounds like somebody versed in philosophy. Verse 38, Pilate said to him, what is truth? See, the philosophy, even to this day, has this idea that you cannot pin truth down, that truth is subjective to individuals, and that one person's truth is different from another person's truth. And so Pilate is convinced now, apparently, that he's talking to a philosopher who thinks of kingship as being something metaphysical, that his kingdom is not of this world. So from Pilate's viewpoint as the governor, he doesn't believe there's any reason for a capital charge. So after he had said this to Jesus, he went back outside to the Jews and told them, I find no guilt in him. So now he has declared for the very first time that there's no reason for Rome to execute this man by crucifixion. Now that does not make it doesn't make the Jewish Sanhedrin members happy, because they thought that this was a fait accompli. They thought this was a done deal, that all they'd have to do is hand him over and he'd be on the cross within a matter of minutes, and it's not going their way. And so they became very insistent about their charges. From Matthew chapter 27, verse 12. When he was accused by the chief priests and elders, he gave no answer. So they are saying all sorts of nasty things about him to Pilate. And he's not talking back. Jesus is remaining mute. He's like a lamb before his shearers is dumb, right? And then Pilate said to him, do you not hear how many things they're testifying against you? But he gave him no answer, not even a single charge, not even to a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed. It seems as if Jesus won't talk in the presence of the Jewish Sanhedrin. He only talks to Pilate when they're not around. Well, we've run out of time for today, so we will come back next time and get into the Word in Luke 23.